On June 18, 2020, an auditor sat down to sign off on a set of accounts he had checked 100 times before. This time, he couldn't do it, nearly €2 billion, money the company swore was sitting safely in two banks in the Philippines, simply wasn't there. Within a week, the company's CEO would resign. Within 10 days, he'd be arrested. And the company's second-in-command, the man who actually ran the operation, would vanish, not flee to a nearby country. Vanish. To this day, nobody official knows exactly where he is. The company was called Wirecard. For a while, it was worth more than Deutsche Bank. Germany's finance ministry defended it. The country's spy agency, reportedly, had used its coup as a source. And almost the entire company, a quarter of its balance sheet, turned out to be smoke. This is the story of how a payments company from a small town in Bavaria became one of the most audacious frauds in European history, and how it fooled regulators, auditors, and investors for the better part of 2 decades. Wirecard was founded in Munich in 1999, and in its earliest days it wasn't processing payments for anyone glamorous. It was piping money to online porn and gambling sites, the kind of high-risk merchants that traditional banks wouldn't touch. That business model would matter later because it meant Wirecard built its entire identity on operating in the corners of finance nobody else wanted to inspect too carefully. In 2002, a former KPMG consultant named Marcus Brown took over as CEO. Brown had the look and the language of a tech visionary, turtlenecks, talk of digital transformation, and almost messianic confidence. Under him, Wirecard cleaned up its image, moved into mainstream card processing, and in 2005 listed on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. The company's growth story from there looked almost too good. It undercut competitors on fees, expanded aggressively into Asia and the Middle East, and by 2018 had done something remarkable. It pushed out Commerzbank, an actual century-old German bank, for a spot in the DAX, Germany's index of its 30 largest listed companies. At its peak, Wirecard's market value passed €23 billion. It was, on paper, bigger than Deutsche Bank. The man widely credited with engineering that international growth was Wirecard's chief operating officer, Jan Marsalek, a charismatic Austrian who cultivated relationships everywhere from Libyan generals to, allegedly, Russian intelligence contacts. Marsalek ran the company's expansion into Southeast Asia and the Middle East, and specifically its network of so-called third-party acquirers, outside partners who supposedly processed payments on Wirecard's behalf in markets where Wirecard didn't hold its own licenses. That third-party acquirer model would turn out to be the whole trick. Here's the uncomfortable truth about Wirecard's fraud. It wasn't hidden. It was hiding in plain sight for years. Starting in January 2019, the Financial Times ran a series of investigative pieces alleging accounting irregularities inside Wirecard's Asian division, the very division Marsalek oversaw. The allegations were specific that Wirecard's finance team had inflated sales and profits, and that a huge share of its reported revenue was coming from those obscure third-party partners in Manila, Singapore, and Dubai, partners who, on inspection, barely seemed to exist as real operating businesses. Wirecard's response was aggressive denial. It called the FT's reporting a coordinated attack by short sellers trying to manipulate the stock. And remarkably, German regulators believed the company over the newspaper. BaFin, Germany's financial watchdog, opened an investigation, not into Wirecard, but into the journalists and short sellers, on suspicion of market manipulation. For a period between February and April 2019, BaFin even banned short selling of Wirecard shares altogether, an extraordinary move that effectively shielded the company from market skepticism. This is worth sitting with for a second. Germany's financial regulator spent 2019 protecting the fraud instead of investigating it. Meanwhile, Wirecard kept using its reputation to raise money. Reporting later alleged that the company forged client data and internal records to help secure roughly €900 million in investment from Japan's SoftBank. An additional funding tied to that relationship, using SoftBank's association as a stamp of legitimacy to reassure everyone else. By late 2019, the pressure had grown too large to fully suppress. Wirecard brought in KPMG to run an independent special audit meant to clear its name once and for all. It didn't. When KPMG published its findings on April 28, 2020, the report was damning by omission. Wirecard had failed to provide sufficient documentation to substantiate a large share of the profits from those third-party partners. KPMG couldn't verify roughly €1 billion in cash balances. The company's own hand-picked auditor couldn't confirm the money was real. The company kept stalling. Its final 2019 results were delayed 3 separate times, and then the walls came down fast. On June 18, 2020, Wirecard's longtime external auditor, EY, refused to sign off on the 2019 accounts, stating it could not confirm the existence of €1.9 billion held in trust accounts in the Philippines, money that represented close to a quarter of Wirecard's entire balance sheet. The next day, June 19th, CEO Marcus Brown resigned as the company's search for the missing cash hit a dead end and it scrambled for a financial lifeline from its banks. 3 days after that, on June 22nd, Wirecard issued the statement that ended it. The €1.9 billion probably never existed at all. Brown was arrested that same day. Jan Marsalek was dismissed without notice and disappeared. An arrest warrant followed within days. On June 25, 2020, Wirecard filed for insolvency. Of everyone involved in Wirecard, Jan Marsalek is the character the story never fully closes on. He was the operational architect of the fraud, the man who built and managed the network of trust partners that turned out to be largely fictitious. And when the company collapsed, he didn't wait around for police. He fled, reportedly through Austria and eventually into Belarus and Russia, aided, according to later investigative reporting, by contacts he'd cultivated in Russian intelligence circles for years beforehand. Interpol issued a red notice for Marsalek in August 2020. As of the trial of his former colleagues, he remained a fugitive, believed to be living under Russian protection. The man who ran the machine that faked a quarter of a listed company's balance sheet has never faced a courtroom. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Wirecard's shares, once worth more than Deutsche Bank's, collapsed by roughly 98%. Investors who had trusted a DAX-listed, EY-audited company lost fortunes almost overnight. Banks were left holding an estimated €3.1 billion in loans and write-downs tied to a company that had partly been fiction. It wasn't only Wirecard's leadership that failed here. It was the entire German system built to prevent exactly this. The supervisory board failed to ask hard enough questions. BaFin, the regulator, spent a year investigating journalists instead of the company they were reporting on. And Germany's political establishment had, in some cases, actively vouched for Wirecard. Chancellor Angela Merkel had promoted the company on a state visit to China in 2019, unaware of what was underneath. Marcus Brown was formally charged with fraud and false accounting, alongside several other former executives, and went on trial in Munich in December 2022, facing up to 15 years in prison if convicted. He has consistently denied wrongdoing, claiming he too was deceived by a shadow structure operating inside his own company. A verdict wasn't expected until 2024 at the earliest. What makes Wirecard different from a lot of the frauds in this series isn't the size of the number. €1.9 billion is large, but it's not the largest we'll cover. It's how long the system had every opportunity to catch it and chose, again and again, to believe the fraud over the free press exposing it. Brown had the look of a visionary. Marsalek had the charm of a fixer. And for over a year, an entire national regulator decided that was more credible than a newspaper doing its job. The full accounting of what happened at Wirecard still isn't finished. One of its central figures has never been caught. Next time on the Ledger Files, we follow the money to Houston and the company that invented a way to book profits that hadn't happened yet.